The sun hung low over Mississippi, a blood-orange smear in the sky, as Elijah Carter stepped off the dusty road and into the suffocating heat of another day meant to break him. The year was 1937, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat and oppression, the kind that clung to your skin like a second layer, a reminder that freedom was just another word white folks used to keep you hoping. Elijah's hands, calloused from years of swinging a pickaxe in the sun-blasted fields, clenched at his sides as he passed the "Whites Only" sign nailed crookedly to the general store's door. Inside, laughter spilled out, rich, easy, the sound of men who'd never known the weight of a boot on their neck. He kept walking. He'd learned early that hunger was easier to bear than the humiliation of being turned away, or worse, the sharp crack of a sheriff's baton across his back for daring to look a white man in the eye. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of dust and crushed dreams, leading him home to the shotgun shack where his mama's tired voice would greet him with the same question, "You make it through the day, baby?" And every evening, he'd lie through his teeth, "Yes, Mama, I made it." But the truth was, making it through the day wasn't the same as living. The truth was, Elijah was drowning in a world that had already decided he was less than human. The nights were worse. The dark brought no relief, only the phantom echoes of screams from the last lynching, a horror so routine the newspapers barely bothered to print the names anymore. Elijah would lie on his pallet, the rough fabric scratching his skin, and stare at the ceiling where the kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows like specters. His mind would race. Images of his father, taken when Elijah was just a boy, dragged from their home by men in white hoods, his crime nothing more than a misplaced word to the wrong person. The memory was a wound that never healed, festering beneath the surface, feeding the rage that simmered in his chest. But rage was a luxury he couldn't afford. Rage got you killed. So he swallowed it down, let it curdle in his gut, and prayed to a God he wasn't sure listened to folks like him. Then came the day everything changed. It started with a whisper, a rumor passed between the field hands when the overseer wasn't listening. Old Man Hargrove, the plantation owner, had been digging up land near the creek, and someone had seen bones, human bones, unearthed by the recent rains. Elijah wouldn't have cared, except the whisper carried a name, Isaiah Carter. His father. The revelation hit him like a fist to the throat. They'd told him his father ran away, that he'd abandoned them. But the truth was worse. The truth was buried in that dirt, and Elijah couldn't let it stay there. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he crept to the creek with nothing but a rusted shovel and a heart full of vengeance. The earth gave way easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting for him. And then he saw it, the glint of a rusted chain, the skeletal wrists still shackled. His father hadn't run. He'd been murdered. The weight of it crushed him. Elijah fell to his knees, the scream building in his chest, but dying on his lips. He couldn't make a sound. They'd hear him. They'd come. And then he'd be just another body in an unmarked grave. But as he knelt there, his fingers brushing the cold, brittle bones of the man he'd spent a lifetime mourning, something inside him snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the years of bending his head, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. They would keep taking and taking until there was nothing left of him but dust. The decision came like a lightning strike. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He'd take the truth and shove it in their faces, even if it killed him. The next morning, as the sun rose, like a slow bleed over the horizon, Elijah walked into town with his father's bones cradled in his arms. The streets were already filling with white folks going about their day, their laughter cutting off as they saw him. The sheriff's hand went to his pistol. "Boy, you best put that down." But Elijah kept walking, his voice steady for the first time in his life. "This is Isaiah Carter. He didn't run. He was murdered. And I'm done pretending otherwise." The silence that followed was thicker than the humidity, heavier than the chains his father had died in. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sheriff spat. "You're gonna regret this, and **R. Elijah knew he would. But as the first blow landed, As the crowd closed in like vultures, he realized something else too. Regret was a small price to pay for defiance. The pain was sharp, the blood warm on his face. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He'd forced them to see. And that was something they could never take away. Elijah's body hit the dirt, the sheriff's boot crashing into his ribs like a hammer splitting wood, the pain radiating through him in waves that blurred his vision but couldn't dull the fire in his chest. The crowd had swarmed like locusts, their faces twisted in fury, spitting words that cut deeper than the blows. Uppity and *****, know your place, should have strung you up with your daddy. The bones of Isaiah Carter lay scattered in the dust, kicked aside like trash, and Elijah's fingers clawed at the earth, trying to reach them, to reclaim some last shred of dignity for the man who had brought him into this world only to be erased from it. A fist connected with his jaw, snapping his head back, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He could hear his mama's voice in his head, screaming from the edges of the mob where they'd held her back, her cries like a knife twisting in his gut. Elijah! Elijah, baby, please! But he couldn't answer, couldn't even lift his head, not with the weight of their hatred pressing him into the ground. The sheriff yanked him up by his collar, the fabric tearing, his breath hot and rancid in Elijah's face. You think you're smart, boy? You think bringing bones into town makes you a man? Elijah's vision swam, but he forced his eyes open, meeting the sheriff's gaze with a defiance that made the man's face darken. I think, Elijah gasped, blood bubbling on his lips, you're afraid. The sheriff's fist came down again, but Elijah barely felt it this time. The world narrowed to a tunnel, the voices around him muffled, his body no longer his own. He was floating, untethered, watching from somewhere outside himself as they dragged him toward the old oak tree at the edge of town, its branches stretching like skeletal fingers against the sky. The rope was coarse in his hands when they shoved it at him, a sick joke, a final humiliation. Tie it yourself, and ****. Let's see how brave you are now. Elijah's fingers trembled, but not from fear, from rage, white-hot and all-consuming. He looked at the faces around him, the men who had eaten at his mama's table when times were hard, the women who had pretended kindness when they needed their floors scrubbed, the children who had been taught to hate him before they could even spell their own names. This was the world they had built. This was the world he was supposed to accept. And then, like a miracle or a curse, a voice cut through the noise. Stop. The crowd parted, and Old Man Hargrove himself stepped forward, his face unreadable. The sheriff hesitated. This ain't your concern, Hargrove. But Hargrove didn't flinch. That boy's my property. You hang him, you're stealing from me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elijah's knees buckled, but Hargrove's men caught him before he hit the ground. Take him to the barn, Hargrove ordered. I'll deal with him myself. The barn was dark, the air thick with the scent of hay and old blood. They chained Elijah to a post, his arms wrenched behind him, the metal biting into his wrists. Hargrove stood over him, his face half-shadowed, the flickering lantern light carving deep grooves into his features. You got a death wish, boy? Elijah didn't answer. Hargrove sighed, rubbing his temples like Elijah was nothing more than a nuisance. I knew your daddy. He was a good worker. But he asked too many questions. Just like you. Elijah's breath hitched. You killed him. Hargrove's smile was thin, humorless. This world killed him. I just made sure it didn't cause me any trouble. Then came the revelation, the one that would haunt Elijah for the rest of his days. Hargrove leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You want to know the real joke? Your daddy wasn't even the first. There's more bones out there than you could count. Men, women, children. This land was built on them. And it'll keep being built on them long after you're gone. Elijah's stomach twisted. Why are you telling me this? Hargrove straightened, brushing dust from his sleeves. Because I want you to understand. You can't win. You can't change anything. The best you can do is survive. Survive. The word echoed in Elijah's skull as they left him there, bleeding and broken. The night stretched on, endless, the chains cutting deeper with every shallow breath. He thought of his mama, waiting for him, praying for him. He thought of the bones in the dirt, the ones he couldn't save, the ones no one would ever speak of. And he thought of the rope, still hanging from the oak tree, waiting for the next fool who dared to stand up. Dawn came, pale and indifferent. The barn door creaked open, and for a wild, delirious moment, Elijah thought it might be death coming for him at last. But it was just one of Hargrove's field hands, a boy no older than Elijah himself, his eyes wide with fear. "They say you're to work today," the boy whispered. "They say if you don't, they'll take your mama instead." Elijah's blood ran cold. Of course. This was their game. They wouldn't kill him, not yet. They'd make him live with it. The fields were the same as always, the sun just as cruel, the overseer's whip just as ready. Elijah moved like a ghost, his body obeying, while his mind screamed. Around him, the other workers kept their heads down, their silence a wall between them and him. He was marked now. Trouble. And trouble was contagious. Days bled into weeks. Elijah worked. He ate. He slept. But something in him had snapped, something that couldn't be fixed. At night, he'd lie awake, listening to the sounds of the plantation, the crickets, the distant howl of a dog, the occasional scream from the cabins where the overseer took his pleasures. And he'd think of the bones. One evening, as the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, Elijah slipped away. Not to run. Not to hide. But to dig. He found the spot near the creek again, the earth still disturbed from before. And he dug. Deeper this time. Past his father's remains, past the rusted chains, until his shovel hit something else. A skull. Small. A child's. His hand shook as he lifted it, the weight of it unbearable. How many more? How many had they buried like secrets? The sound of footsteps made him freeze. He turned, expecting the sheriff, expecting death. But it was just old man Hargrove, standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with something almost like pity. "You still digging up ghosts, boy?" Elijah's voice was raw. "They're not ghosts. They're people." Hargrove sighed. "And what you gonna do about it? Tell the world? Who's gonna believe you?" Elijah had no answer. That was the cruelest truth of all. The world didn't care. The world would keep turning, and the bones would keep piling up, and someday, even his own would join them. But then Hargrove did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Names," he said quietly. "All of them. Dates. Places." Elijah stared at it, uncomprehending. "Why?" Hargrove's face was grim. "Because even the devil gets tired." And then he walked away, leaving Elijah alone in the gathering dark, the list burning in his hands like a promise or a curse. The paper trembled in Elijah's bleeding hands as the last of Hargrove's footsteps faded into the night, the weight of that single fragile sheet heavier than all the chains he'd ever worn. The names swam before his eyes: Isaiah Carter, Moses Johnson, little Sarah May with her 6 years marked neat beside her name, each one a life erased, a story silenced, a scream swallowed by the indifferent earth. The dates stretched back further than he'd imagined, past his grandfather's time, past slavery's official end, a secret ledger of blood written in the soil of the very land he'd worked since childhood. His breath came in ragged gasps as the truth coiled around his heart like a noose. This wasn't just murder, it was harvest, a systematic culling that fed the roots of cotton with black bones. The night air turned thick as molasses in his lungs as he carefully reburied the tiny skull, his callous fingers tracing the fragile curve one last time before covering it with Mississippi dirt that would never be clean again. Dawn found him back in the fields, his body moving through the motions of work while his mind raced like a hunted animal. The list burned against his thigh where he'd sewn it into his ragged pants, each rustle of fabric against skin a reminder of the dangerous knowledge he carried. Around him, The other sharecroppers bent like broken reeds under the overseer's gaze, their eyes carefully blank whenever they passed near him. He could feel the change in the air, the way conversations died when he approached, how the women pulled their children closer when he walked by. They knew. Everyone always knew. And knowing was dangerous. That evening, as he dragged himself back toward the row of crumbling shacks they called home, he saw the first sign of fresh news dangling from the oak tree, swaying gently in the twilight breeze like some grotesque fruit. The message was clear. The sheriff leaned against the trunk, cleaning his nails with a Bowie knife, his smile all teeth, when he caught Elijah's eye. "Evening, boy. Sleep tight." The shack was dark when he entered, the smell of boiled turnips and despair thick in the close air. His mama sat hunched over the cold hearth, her once proud spine bent like a question mark from years of bending to white folks' wills. She didn't turn when he entered, just whispered, "They was here a-skin 'bout you," in a voice scraped raw from crying. Elijah knelt beside her, the weight of all his years pressing down until he thought his bones might snap. Her hands, gnarled as old roots, clutched at his shirt. "They got a paper says you stole from Hargrove. Says they can take you legal now." A cold laugh bubbled up in Elijah's throat. Legal. Like anything in Mississippi was legal when it came to folks like them. He pressed his forehead against her trembling hands, breathing in the scent of lye soap and fear, memorizing the feel of her skin like he might never touch her again. "I ain't stole nothing, Mama," he lied, smooth as river stones. "Just a misunderstanding, Dot." That night he waited until her breathing evened out in sleep before slipping from the pallet, his few precious things already tied in a bundle beneath the floorboards. The list pulsed against his leg like a second heartbeat as he crept to the door, pausing when the floorboard creaked like a dying man's last breath. His mama's voice stopped him cold. "You leavin' then?" Not a question. Elijah turned to see her sitting upright in the dark, her eyes gleaming wet in the moonlight slicing through the cracks in the walls. He opened his mouth to lie again, but the words turned to ash on his tongue. Her nod was slow, resigned. "Ain't no life for you here. Ain't never been." She rose stiffly, pulling something from beneath her mattress, a rusted railroad spike and a crumpled $5 bill. "Your daddy hid this 'fore they took him. Said one day you might need to buy your freedom proper." The spike was cold in his palm, its edges still sharp after all these years buried in the dirt. His daddy's last gift. A weapon. A promise. The sound of dogs barking in the distance sent them both stiffening. His mama's hands flew to his face, memorizing his features like she was carving them into stone. "Go now, child. And don't look back." The kiss she pressed to his forehead burned like a brand. Elijah slipped out the back as the first torchlights appeared at the end of the row, the sheriff's voice cutting through the night like a saw blade. He ran, not toward the woods where they'd expect him to go, but straight through the cotton fields, the plants whipping at his legs like grasping fingers as he made for the old drainage ditch that ran all the way to the river. The baying of hounds grew closer, their howls threading with the shouts of men drunk on hate and the intoxicating thrill of the hunt. His chest burned, each breath a knife between his ribs, as he plunged into the icy black water of the ditch, the list in his pants suddenly feeling like a death warrant. The river welcomed him with greedy arms, the current pulling at his clothes as he fought to keep his head above water. Gunshots cracked over the rushing water, the bullets kicking up little geysers around him as he dove under, letting the Mississippi carry him like it had carried so many before, some to freedom, most to unmarked graves. When he finally dragged himself onto the opposite bank miles downstream, his hands clawing at the mud like a man climbing from his own coffin, the first gray light of dawn was staining the sky. He lay there heaving, the river's gift clutched in his fist, the railroad spike, his daddy's last defiance. The list had survived too, the ink bleeding but still legible, the names now his to bear. 3 days later, starving and half-mad with thirst, Elijah stumbled onto a railroad track cutting through the piney woods. The steel gleamed in the sunlight, stretching north like a promise. Somewhere up those tracks was Chicago, was Harlem, was places where a black man might breathe without permission. But as he stood there, his bare feet on the warm rails, he realized with sudden clarity that running wasn't freedom. Not really. Not while the names on that list cried out from unmarked graves. Not while his mama still bid her back in Hargrove's fields. Not while new names kept getting added to that terrible ledger. The train whistle screamed in the distance, the ground trembling beneath him as the beast approached. Elijah Carter stood at the crossroads of his life, the railroad spike heavy in one hand, the list of the dead burning in the other. The wind carried the scent of cotton and blood as the train rounded the bend, its iron wheels singing against the tracks like a sword being drawn. The thunder of the approaching train vibrated through Elijah's bones as he stood paralyzed between past and future, the railroad spike biting into his palm as his daddy's ghost whispered one way and the wailing steam whistle screamed the other. The ground trembled beneath his bare feet as the monstrous iron horse rounded the bend, its single great eye blazing through the morning mist like the wrath of God himself, the stink of burning coal and hot metal filling his nose as the wind whipped his tattered shirt against his skeletal frame. In that suspended heartbeat before decision, his life flashed before him not as memories, but as scars, the lash marks on his back from when he'd reached for a drink from the white's only well, the crooked finger broken by the overseer's boot when he'd worked too slow with fever, the phantom ache of his daddy's arms around him before the night riders came, that last desperate hug that smelled of sweat and fear and love. The train was close enough now that he could see the engineer's face, a white man squinting against the sun, his hand hovering over the brake lever, as he spotted the ragged black figure standing trackside like some vengeful spirit risen from the red dirt. Elijah's muscles coiled as the great machine bore down on him, the names on the hidden list burning against his thigh like brands: Moses Johnson, Sarah May, Isaiah Carter, each one a chain trying to drag him back to Mississippi mud. With a roar torn from the deepest cavern of his soul, Elijah launched himself not onto the fleeing train, but alongside the tracks, his bare feet pounding the gravel as he ran parallel to the screaming beast, the railroad spike raised high like a warrior's sword as he brought it down with all his fury onto the first rail tie, the shock of impact jolting up his arm like lightning as the sound of splintering wood was swallowed by the train's thunder. The engineer leaned out, his face purpling with rage as he screamed curses lost in the wind, but Elijah was already moving to the next tie, then the next, each blow of the spike sending tremors through the track as the train's brakes began their tortured screech. The world narrowed to the rhythm of destruction. The spikes arced through air, the crack of sundered wood, the metallic scream of overloaded rails until with a groan, like the earth splitting open, a section of track buckled just as the locomotive's weight came upon it. Time seemed to fracture as the great engine lurched, its front wheels leaving the rails in a shower of sparks that lit up the dawn like hellfire, the following cars accordioning into one another with a sound like Judgment Day as Elijah dove into the ditch, his body pressed into the mud as shrapnel of wood and metal sighed through the air above him. When the cacophony of twisting metal finally stilled, replaced by the moans of injured men and the hiss of escaping steam, Elijah rose from the ditch like a specter, his chest heaving as he took in the devastation, the locomotive on its side, like a felled beast, white men crawling from shattered cars with blood on their faces, the crates of Hargrove's cotton bales spilling their contents like guts from a slaughtered animal. The engineer spotted him first, his eyes widening in recognition before his hand went to the pistol at his belt, but Elijah was already moving, slipping into the tree line with the spike still clutched in his fist, the list of names now joined by this fresh act of rebellion. He ran not north toward freedom, but south back toward the plantation, toward his mama's shack, toward the buried bones and the hanging tree, because he finally understood freedom wasn't a place the railroad could take you. It was the fire you carried inside, the names you refused to let die, the spikes you drove into the tracks of the machine that sought to grind you down. The wood swallowed him whole as behind, the first sirens began to wail, but Elijah Carter was already gone, his shadow merging with the ghosts of all those who came before as he disappeared into the waiting pines, the taste of soot and blood on his lips, the weight of the spike in his hand, and in his heart, the terrible knowledge that the story never really ends, it just changes hands. The dense pine forest swallowed Elijah whole, as he moved like a shadow between the towering trunks, his bare feet silent on the carpet of brown needles, while behind him, the wreckage of the train still sent plumes of black smoke into the morning sky. The railroad spike in his hand had become an extension of his arm, its cold weight a constant reminder of both his father's legacy and the irreversible line he crossed back there on the tracks. As he ran, the names on the hidden list seemed to whisper to him from the rustling leaves: Isaiah Carter, Moses Johnson, little Sarah May, their voices blending with the distant shouts of the search parties already forming, the baying of bloodhounds that would soon catch his scent. The forest thinned suddenly, revealing the back acres of Hargrove's plantation where the cotton grew sparse and weedy, the plants here left to struggle in the poor soil, while the prime fields were worked to death by bent-back sharecroppers. Elijah dropped to his belly in the tall grass, his nostrils flaring at the familiar stink of pesticide and sweat as he watched a line of field hands moving through the rows, their movements mechanical with exhaustion, their faces blank masks hiding the same fury that now coursed through his own veins. A gunshot cracked in the distance, followed by another, the sound sending a flock of crows exploding into the sky like black confetti. They were hunting him in earnest now, not just for wrecking the train, but for daring to strike back at the machine that had crushed them all for generations. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture from the grass around him until every rustle sounded like approaching footsteps. Every bird call might be a lookout signal. He waited until the field hands moved to the far edge of the acre before crawling forward on elbows and knees, his body pressed so low to the ground that the cotton plants brushed his back like the fingers of the dead urging him on. The old drainage ditch appeared ahead, its steep sides choked with brambles, but still the safest path toward the slave cemetery where Hargrove had been burying his secrets for decades. Elijah slid into the ditch just as a shout went up from the north field they'd found his trail. The cool darkness of the ditch enveloped him as he scrambled forward on hands and knees, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears as the brambles tore at his arms and face, leaving thin trails of blood that would lead the hound straight to him if he didn't move faster. The ditch opened suddenly into the crumbling remains of a brick culvert built before the war, its arched ceiling dripping with stagnant water that reflected the dim light in greasy rainbows. Here in this forgotten space between worlds, Elijah allowed himself one shuddering breath before pressing onward, his fingers finding the familiar notches in the bricks that marked the way to the hidden tunnel his daddy had shown him as a boy, the old escape route used by field hands during slavery times, its existence passed down in whispers from one generation of broken men to the next. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and the faint iron tang of old blood as Elijah wriggled through its narrow confines, the railroad spike scraping against the walls as he pulled himself forward inch by agonizing inch. Somewhere above him, the world continued on as it always had, overseers shouting, wagons creaking under their loads of stolen cotton, children being taught how to bend before they could even stand straight, while below, a single angry man moved like a worm through the heart of the beast. The tunnel opened at last into a shallow depression behind the slave cemetery, its leaning markers so weathered by time that most names had been erased completely, just like the lives they once represented. Elijah lay panting in the tall grass, watching as a column of armed men fanned out across the far field, their rifles glinting in the noon sun like the teeth of some great predator. He counted 12 in all: the sheriff, 3 deputies, and 8 white men from town, still dressed in their Sunday clothes, but carrying shotguns and rope like this was some kind of church picnic. Closer still, near the smoking ruins of the train wreck, a cluster of women in wide-brimmed hats pointed toward the woods where he'd disappeared, their faces alight with the kind of righteous fury only the truly privileged could muster. But Elijah's eyes were drawn to the lone figure standing apart from the others, his crisp white suit untouched by the soot and chaos around him, old man Hargrove himself, his face an unreadable mask, as he stared not at the wreckage, but at the forest line, as if he could see straight through the trees to where Elijah hid. There was something in that gaze that made Elijah's blood run cold, not anger, not even hatred, but the calm calculation of a man who'd spent a lifetime weighing human lives against cotton yields and found the math always came out in his favor. A twig snapped behind him, and Elijah rolled instinctively, the railroad spike coming up just as a small figure emerged from the brush. Jeremiah, the 12-year-old water boy who brought dippers to the field hands, his eyes wide with fear and something else Elijah couldn't quite name. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the spike trembling in Elijah's hand as he weighed the risk, until the boy reached into his tattered shirt and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a chunk of cornbread, 2 strips of fatty pork, and a canteen of water that sloshed like music when Elijah snatched it and drank greedily. "They say you killed 3 white men on that train," Jeremiah whispered, his voice equal parts awe and terror. Elijah wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the food sitting heavy in his shrunken stomach. "Ain't killed nobody," he grunted. "Just the train." The boy's eyes flickered toward the armed men in the distance. "They gonna hang you sure if they catch you." Elijah studied the child's face, the same face he'd seen on his younger self, the same face he'd seen on his daddy in the one photograph they'd owned before the night riders burned their shack down. "You gonna turn me in?" Jeremiah shook his head so hard his ragged hat nearly fell off. "Nah, sir. My mama say you got the spirit in you. Say it's the same spirit made my granddaddy walk clean to Canada with nothing but a pocket full of pecans and a Bible." He reached into his pocket again and produced a single match, its red tip bright against his dark palm. "She say to give you this too." Elijah took the match with fingers that suddenly felt too big for his hands, the tiny stick of wood and phosphorus suddenly heavier than the railroad spike, heavier than the list of names, heavier than all the chains Mississippi had ever wrapped around his people. Somewhere beyond the trees, a woman's scream split the air, not a scream of fear but of rage, a sound Elijah recognized instantly as his mama's voice raised in defiance. The armed men turned as one toward the sound, their weapons coming up as they began moving not toward the woods, but toward the row of shacks where the field hands lived. Jeremiah's breath came fast now, his small body trembling like a rabbit's. "They fixing to burn the quarters looking for you. Done already took your mama." The match in Elijah's fingers seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as the pieces fell into place. Hargrove hadn't been staring at the woods because he expected Elijah to run. He'd been staring because he knew Elijah would come back. This had never been a manhunt. It was a trap. And like a fool, Elijah had walked straight into it. The boy grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "They got her at the big house. Say if you ain't come by sundown, they gonna." His voice broke, the words too terrible for a child's tongue. Elijah stood slowly, the weight of the spike in one hand and the match in the other, the names on the list burning against his thigh like living coals. Somewhere beyond the trees, his mama was waiting. Somewhere beyond the trees, the hanging oak stood ready. Somewhere beyond the trees, the bones of his father and countless others cried out from their unmarked graves. The sun hung low in the sky now, painting the cotton fields in shades of blood and gold as Elijah Carter stepped out from the shelter of the trees, his back straight for the first time in his life, the railroad spike and the match held like weapons in his hands, the ghosts of the past at his back and the fire of rebellion in his eyes. The story doesn't end here. It can't, because Elijah is done running. And Mississippi is about to learn what happens when a man with nothing left to lose finally decides to fight back. The golden light of dusk bled across the cotton fields as Elijah emerged from the tree line, his silhouette cutting a stark figure against the crimson horizon like a blade drawn across the throat of the day. The match and railroad spike felt fused to his palms now, extensions of his very bones, as he walked with deliberate steps toward the plantation house, its white columns glowing pink in the dying light like exposed ribs of some long-dead beast. Behind him, the forest seemed to hold its breath, while ahead, the first shouts went up from the fields where armed men turned as one toward the approaching figure, their rifles swinging up with the smooth efficiency of those accustomed to aiming at unarmed black bodies. Elijah's bare feet left dark prints in the dusty soil, each step carrying him past landmarks of his personal cavalry, the tool shed where he'd been locked for 2 days without water after questioning his wages, the whipping post still stained dark with generations of blood, the gnarled oak where as a child he'd watched them string up old Ben for smiling at the overseer's wife. The air smelled of burning pine and something sharper, more metallic. As he passed the smoldering remains of his own shack, the roof collapsed inward like a crushed skull, his mama's few precious possessions, a hair comb from her wedding day, a tattered quilt stitched with African patterns, now just blackened scraps in the ashes. The armed men formed a loose semicircle around him, their guns trained on his chest, but their eyes flickering with something new, not fear exactly, but the dawning realization that the calculus had changed, that the equation of oppression they'd balanced so carefully for generations had just been upended by one ragged man with fire in his eyes. Sheriff Tate stepped forward, his revolver steady in one hand, while the other clutched a coiled rope already knotted into a noose, his florid face split by a grin that showed too many teeth. "Well, look what the dogs didn't have to drag in," he drawled, the laughter of his deputies rising like hyena cries around him. Elijah kept walking until the barrel of Tate's pistol pressed cold against his forehead, the metal imprinting his skin like a brand, as he finally stopped, his breathing steady despite the galloping of his heart. The silence stretched taut between them until Tate's grin faltered, his finger twitching on the trigger as Elijah's unblinking stare bore into him. "Ain't you got nothing to say, boy?" Tate hissed, the stink of whiskey and rotting teeth washing over Elijah's face. Elijah's voice when it came was low, calm, the voice of a man who'd already crossed over to someplace beyond fear. "You got my mama." The words hung in the air like smoke as the plantation house door creaked open and old man Hargrove emerged, his white suit immaculate in the gathering twilight, one hand gripping Mama Carter's thin arm as he dragged her onto the veranda. Her face was a mask of bruises, one eye swollen shut, but her remaining eye blazed with a pride that made Elijah's chest ache. Hargrove's voice carried across the yard with the ease of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You cost me near $10,000 today, boy. That train was carrying my best cotton to market." He gave Mama Carter's arm a vicious twist, drawing a gasp that sent red-hot fury coursing through Elijah's veins. "But we'll call it square if you hand over what you stole from me." The sheriff's pistol dug harder into Elijah's forehead as understanding dawned. They didn't know about the list. They thought he'd taken money, something tangible, something white men valued. The match in Elijah's left hand seemed to grow warmer as his fingers twitched around it, his right hand tightening on the railroad spike until the edges bit into his palm. Hargrove's patience evaporated like morning dew as he shoved Mama Carter to her knees, drawing a pearl-handled revolver from his jacket and pressing it to her temple. "Last chance, boy. Give me what's mine." The world seemed to narrow to that single terrible point, the gun against his mama's head, the armed men circling like vultures, the setting sun painting everything in shades of blood and fire. Elijah's gaze locked with his mama's one good eye, and in that endless moment he saw not fear, but permission, not a plea for mercy, but a warrior's cry passed down through generations of stolen people. When he moved, it was with the speed of a man who had already made peace with death, the match flaring to life with a single strike against the railroad spike, the tiny flame dancing like a liberated spirit in the twilight as every gun in the yard cocked in unison. But instead of lunging forward, Elijah dropped to his knees and plunged the burning match into the dry grass at his feet, the flames leaping up with unnatural speed as if the very earth had been waiting decades for this moment. Confusion rippled through the armed men as the fire raced along hidden trails of kerosene Elijah had poured throughout the summer drought, paths leading straight to the cotton gins, the equipment sheds, the outbuildings stuffed with Hargrove's precious harvest. The realization struck Tate first, his face purpling with rage, as he swung the pistol from Elijah's head toward his chest. "You goddamn!" The gunshot cracked like thunder, but Elijah was already moving, the railroad spike finding its home in Tate's throat with a wet crunch as the sheriff staggered back, his hands clawing at the metal protruding from his neck like some grotesque new appendage. Chaos erupted as the men turned from the spreading flames to the sudden violence in their midst, their shots going wild, as Elijah yanked the spike free in an arterial spray and dove toward the veranda where Hargrove stood frozen, his revolver still pressed to Mama Carter's head. The world dissolved into a nightmare of smoke and screams as the plantation erupted around them, the carefully laid trails of fire racing through tinder dry fields, while armed men shouted over the roar of the flames. Elijah moved like a man possessed, the spike in his hand finding flesh again and again as he carved a path toward the veranda, his body singing with a terrible joy even as a bullet grazed his ribs, another burning along his thigh. Hargrove's eyes met Elijah's across the burning yard, and in that moment, the old man finally understood. This wasn't about money, wasn't even about revenge. This was reckoning. His hand trembled as he pressed the revolver harder against Mama Carter's temple, his mouth opening to speak just as the railroad spike left Elijah's hand in a spinning arc that ended with a meaty thunk between Hargrove's eyes, the man's body toppling backward like a felled oak as Mama Carter rolled free. The heat from the flames was unbearable now, the air thick with smoke, and the screams of men being swallowed by the inferno they'd spent generations feeding. Elijah stumbled to his mama's side, his hands gentle as he untied the ropes around her wrists, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire, as she cupped his face with trembling hands. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, her thumb brushing his cheekbone where the sheriff's pistol had left its mark. "What have you done?" Elijah turned his face into her palm, breathing in the scent of her skin beneath the blood and smoke, the same smell from his childhood, from before the world had tried to break them both. Around them, Hargrove's empire burned, the flames licking at the white columns of the big house like tongues of righteous fury. Somewhere in the smoke, the list of names curled and blackened at the edges before catching fire entirely, the ashes rising on the thermal winds like a flock of liberated spirits. Elijah helped his mama to her feet as the first stars appeared overhead, their light barely visible through the smoke. The road ahead would be hard. There were borders to cross, hounds and horses that would follow, a whole country built on broken backs that wouldn't take kindly to one of its chattel fighting back. But for this one perfect moment, standing in the eye of the storm they created, Elijah Carter and his mama were free. The story doesn't end here. It can't, because the fire is still spreading. And the night is young. The flames roared like a living thing as Elijah and his mama stumbled through the smoke-choked night, their hands clasped tight as the plantation burned behind them, the firelight painting the sky the color of fresh bruises. The heat licked at their backs as they ran toward the swamp where the search dogs would lose their scent, their bare feet splashing through brackish water that stank of rot and rebirth, the sounds of shouting men and panicked horses fading behind them as the wilderness opened its arms. Elijah's body screamed with every step, the bullet grazed along his ribs weeping blood, his lungs burning from smoke and exhaustion, but his grip on his mama's hand never wavered even when her steps began to falter, her breath coming in ragged gasps as age and abuse threatened to undo her. The cypress trees rose around them like sentinels, their gnarled roots forming a labyrinth that only those born to this land could navigate, the moonlight filtering through Spanish moss in pale ribbons that illuminated their path just enough to keep them from the sucking mud that could swallow a person whole. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, not the freight line Elijah had wrecked but the Midnight Express heading north, its rhythm like a heartbeat as it crossed the state line into territory where a black man and his mama might find shelter if they could just make it that far. The swamp gave way to hard ground as they reached the old contraband trail used by runaway slaves before the war, the path worn smooth by generations of desperate feet, the dirt packed firm by hope and terror in equal measure. Mama Carter collapsed suddenly, her legs giving out as decades of backbreaking labor and tonight's horrors finally overtook her, her hands trembling as she pressed them to Elijah's face in the moonlight. "You go on," she whispered, her voice like wine through dry grass. "These old bones ain't meant for running no more." Elijah shook his head, his throat too tight for words, as he lifted her slight frame into his arms, her weight nothing compared to the bales of cotton he'd hauled his whole life, her warmth against his chest more precious than anything he'd ever carried. The train whistle sounded again, closer now, and Elijah ran toward it like a man possessed, his muscles burning with the effort as the trees thinned and the tracks appeared before them, the steel rails gleaming like twin rivers of salvation in the moonlight. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the express rounded the bend, its great iron wheels throwing sparks as Elijah stumbled onto the gravel embankment, his arms tightening around his mama as the train's blinding light washed over them. For one suspended moment, time ceased. The past with its unmarked graves and burning crosses, the present with its blood and fire, the future that stretched uncertain before them, all collapsed into this single heartbeat as Elijah reached out with one hand toward the passing boxcar, his fingers brushing cold metal as the wind whipped tears from his eyes. Then strong hands grabbed them both, pulling them into the darkness of the freight car where other shadowy figures moved in the gloom, their whispers hushed but urgent as they helped Elijah lower his mama onto a bed of burlap sacks. The train's rhythm changed as it picked up speed, the click-clack of the wheels singing a new song of distance and deliverance as the last traces of Hargrove's burning empire disappeared behind them. In the trembling dark, Mama Carter's hand found Elijah's, her grip surprisingly strong as she pressed something into his palm. The rusted railroad spike, its edges still dark with Tate's blood, its weight now a promise instead of a weapon. Outside, the moon hung full and bright over the rushing landscape, its light catching the faces of the other fugitives huddled in the boxcar. A young mother clutching a baby with eyes too old for its face, an old man missing fingers on his right hand, a teenage boy with scars around his neck like a grotesque necklace, all of them bound together by the unspoken understanding that freedom wasn't a place but a direction. Not a destination, but a constant motion. Elijah leaned his head against the vibrating wall of the car, his body thrumming with exhaustion and adrenaline as the names from the burned list floated through his mind. Isaiah Carter, Moses Johnson, little Sarah May, their voices no longer whispers of grief, but now the steady hum of the tracks beneath them, the rhythmic chant of the wheels carrying them forward into whatever came next. The story doesn't end because stories like this never do. They ripple outward like stones cast into dark water. They smolder like embers waiting for wind. They echo in the spaces between heartbeats when someone somewhere decides they've had enough. The train roared through the night, its whistle screaming defiance at the stars as it carried its cargo of wounded warriors northward, leaving behind only fire and footprints soon washed away by rain, the spike in Elijah's hand still warm from his mama's touch, the future stretching before them like the unspooling tracks, uncertain, unwritten, but finally, blessedly, their own.